The heavy blast door sealed shut, cutting off the shriek of the storm and the dying screams of the men outside. Alara slid down the cold metal wall, her lungs burning, fingers still slick with the blood of an exile she had just killed to save him. Across the tight, dimly lit bunker, Kalen stood frozen. He was tall, rigid, a creature of scale and ash who despised her kind. But right now, his gold-slitted eyes were locked on her trembling hands. Survival demands an alliance with the native who hunts her kind, but this felt dangerously like something else. Truth is, she shouldn't have survived the first hour. Banished to a living nightmare, her only way out was through the deadly wild of Vorith Prime. The prison dropship had spat her out like bad cargo, her pod crashing into a canopy of bloated violet leaves that bled acid when torn. But she crawled out into a suffocating heat, coughing up smoke, the air heavy with the scent of fermenting sap. She spent 2 days outrunning things that wanted to eat her. She learned quickly not to touch the pale, trembling vines that snapped like tripwires. But she didn't see the apex predator. It dropped from the upper canopy, a mass of muscle, teeth, and raw hunger. It had her pinned in the mud. The heat of its open jaw washed over her face, and then it was dead. A spear carved from black bone took the beast through the neck. The creature collapsed, and standing behind it was Kalen. He didn't offer a hand. He merely wrenched his weapon free, looked at her with absolute indifference, and walked away. She wouldn't let him. Alara pulled herself from the mud, muscles screaming, and followed the disturbed moss. She tracked his silent path through the lethal flora, ignoring the burn in her thighs and the sting of toxic pollen in her eyes. He was fast, moving like a ghost, but she was stubborn. She caught up just in time to see the trap spring. 3 humans, feral, desperate exile, who had survived long enough to lose their minds, dropped from the trees. They swarmed Kalen with scavenged vibroblades. He threw the first one off, his immense strength snapping bone, but the other 2 pinned him against a massive root. Alara didn't think. She just moved. She hoisted a heavy, jagged pipe she had ripped from her crash site. The metal hummed with residual charge. She swung it hard. The crack of the pipe connecting with an exile's skull echoed through the thick, humid air. Blood sprayed across her face. The second exile turned on her. But Kalen took the distraction, driving his elbow into the man's throat with a sickening crunch. Silence fell over the clearing, save for their heavy, ragged breathing. Kalen stared at her, really stared at her. This fragile, soft-skinned human had just saved his life. In the most brutal environment in the galaxy, trust becomes the sharpest weapon. He didn't speak. He just turned and jerked his head toward a hidden fissure in the rock face, just as the sky ripped open with a blinding flash. A warning. The nightly atmospheric storm was coming. They ran. He led her through the heavy blast door just as the first acidic raindrops began to sizzle against the stone, which brought them here. Locked in this tight, dark space, the hum of the planet vibrating through the floorboards. Alara wiped the blood from her cheek, her hands shaking from the adrenaline dump. Kalen moved closer, not to attack, but to look at the scrape on her jaw. His massive, scaled fingers hovered an inch from her skin, radiating heat. A hostile world built to kill them instead forged an unstoppable duo. And as the storm raged outside, the space between them suddenly felt a lot more dangerous than the jungle. The heat of his hand vanished as the floor violently pitched. A deep, tectonic groan shuddered through the stone. It wasn't just the storm out there. The tremor brought the frantic scratching of claws, thousands of them, fleeing the weather and slamming blindly into the bunker's exterior walls. The metal buckled under the weight of the massive, panicked migration, but it wasn't claws that finally broke the seal. It was a thermal charge. The heavy blast door blew inward, just throwing Alara hard against the back wall. Her vision blurred. Through the smoke and pouring rain, a heavily armed faction of human exiles swarmed the breach. They had tracked the noise. Kalen didn't hesitate. He shoved Alara deeper into the alcove, stepping into the choke point to take the brunt of the assault. He broke 2 jaws, but there were too many of them. A high-voltage stun baton caught him in the ribs. He dropped to one knee. They dragged him out into the roaring acid rain, leaving the bunker wide open to the elements. Alara didn't freeze. She didn't panic. Truth is, a human pushed to the edge stops being prey and starts being a problem. She slipped out into the downpour, tracking the deep gouges his boots left in the mud. The storm masked her scent, washing away her trail. She found their camp less than a mile away, and nestled in a massive, hollowed-out root system. Kalen was chained to a heavy metal strut, bleeding thick indigo fluid from a cut above his eye. He looked up, his gaze catching the slight movement in the brush. He saw her. His chest hitched. She crept to the perimeter, her hands full of the bloated, fermenting sap pods from the deadly violet plants she had learned to avoid. Volatile, highly acidic. She struck a spark with a broken pipe she still carried, jammed a burning scrap of dry moss into the largest pod, and hurled it directly into the exiles' stacked ammunition crates. The blast was deafening. White-hot light tore through the camp, sending exiles scattering blindly into the toxic brush. Alara sprinted through the smoke. She ignored the burn in her lungs and the ringing in her ears. She reached Kalen, where he grabbed the heavy locking mechanism on his chains and fired a stolen blaster at the hinge at point-blank range. The metal shattered. She grabbed his massive arm. They ran. The chaos behind them bought them precious seconds. They tore through the thick undergrowth, the ground sloping sharply upward as they approached the canyon walls. It was a brutal, vertical climb. Fingers bleeding, slipping on slick stone, catching each other when gravity tried to pull them back down. His strength hauled her over the final ledge into a dry, high-altitude cave, just as her legs gave out entirely. They collapsed onto the cool stone, chests heaving. Safe. Kalen sat up slowly. He reached for a leather pouch tied at his waist and pulled out a crushed red pigment. He didn't ask. He just moved into her space, the heat radiating off his scales. He pressed 2 fingers to her cheek, drawing a sharp, deliberate line of color over her cheekbone, then down her jaw. A claim, a camouflage. He pulled his heavy bone knife from his belt and pressed it into her palm, closing her fingers tight around the hilt. His thumb brushed over her knuckles. The tension that had kept them alive morphed into something terrifyingly quiet. Something permanent. Alara stood, pulling him up with her. They stepped to the lip of the cave, standing shoulder to shoulder. Their breathing finally synced. Below them, the deadly wild stretched out in every direction, violent and untamed. Above them, the clouds finally broke, and the twin suns began to rise.